Hey guys, sorry about that. So, a few weeks ago, I trafficked a Facebook page that I often like by the guy who calls himself on there the well known skeptic. He often writes for the Skeptical Inquirer, which is a magazine dedicated to scientific skepticism that's published the by the Center for Inquiry. Okay, and, one of the questions he had posted on his page was, hey, I plan on meeting Neil deGrasse Tyson to interview him for an article in Skeptical Inquirer magazine. What sort of questions should I ask him? And a bit tongue in cheek, I said, hey, I know this would be probably quite impolitic to ask him, but I would ask him, why is he so against philosophy? Yet he tries to sound so profound in his talks and in his podcast. He sounds like like a cheap fortune cookie when he when he tries to be deep. And no disrespect to Dr. Tyson. I love the guy. I love how he popularizes science. He's inherited a title from the great Carl Sagan. Um, but he and a few other science popularizers openly denigrate philosophy, such as Bill Nye, known as Bill Nye the Science Guy, and another person who's part of the CSI Committee for Skeptical Inquiry is part of CFI, and they're the ones who are responsible for the Skeptical Inquirer magazine. I hope that's not too confusing. They used to call themselves more befuddlingly SciCop, CSICOP, which is clever, but obviously the acronym was too long, so they shortened it to Sci. Um, like Shield. But anyway, um, in any case, uh, the other guy is Lawrence Krauss, who's a science writer and popularizer in Skeptical Inquirer magazine. And I've noticed that it's these guys who are not actual uh, researchers who tend to be against philosophy, whereas some of the guys who are actually deep into doing scientific academic research have a little bit more of appreciation for philosophy, and when I mean particularly philosophy of science. And some of the comments people were astounded. It's like, why would a scientist be against philosophy? It's sort of odd. I agree, but scientists aren't always aware of the philosophical assumptions they make in the work that they do, nor the fact that, at least in academia, when you work in the university, um, it's not a sharp division in philosophy and some of the other sciences, especially like with philosophy of science, because it's usually just a bureaucratic division. Um, Philosophy and science used to be interchangeable terms, believe it or not. Not to mention, the progress in philosophy is uh, also tends to be kind of hidden for various reasons that I'll spell out. So one is that once you acquire a significant body of knowledge in any particular philosophical field, it stops being called philosophy and starts being called science. That's recently happened with cognitive science. Cognitive science was mostly the work being done in uh, epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge, belief, and rationality, um, as well as metaphysics and philosophy of mind, philosophy of language. Those folks still work in cognitive research more on the theoretical side, along with the neuroscientists, anthropologists, linguists, and cognitive psychologists. They all come together to do this interdisciplinary field called cognitive science, which is something that I'm akin to with my background. Okay, um, so that's one of the things. So once philosophy, a field in philosophy, aggregates enough information and knowledge, it starts being called a science instead of philosophy. Another thing is that a lot of progress in philosophy goes unseen because often the case when we come to find answers to philosophical questions, they tend to be quite nuanced and negative in nature. So it's not so much that we learn something, we learn we learn something, but we learn something more that it is not than it is. Okay. So for instance, the meaning of life. All right. Um, Sorry if I hurt anyone's feelings here, but you know, there is no meaning to life outside of taking it on faith. At least there's no reason to think so. So that's one of those things like we answered, but in the negative. So in any case, getting back to this little discussion. So one guy who purports to be a scientist, and I told him I'm not going to doubt him, but he literally did tell me to Google his name, so I have no problem with me mentioning it here because he used his name openly on his Facebook platform, and he told me to Google him as well to ascertain that he's a legit science researcher. And I took him for his word. I did look at, although I trust but verify, isn't that what Reagan said? Well, I did do that. I did trust what he said, but I still went to verify it on Google. Honestly, I couldn't find his name, but that's because it's not an it's a foreign name, and I'm not sure how you pronounce it. Aethon Brang. If anyone has heard of him or know how to pronounce that, I'm sorry if I butchered it. But he basically said, well, philosophy is like being in a dark room and looking for a black cat. Metaphysics is like being in a dark room and looking for a black cat that isn't there. Theology is like being in a dark room and looking for a black cat that isn't there and shouting, I found it. Science is like being in a dark room looking for a black cat while using a flashlight. Clever, but wrong. Who do you think gave you the flashlight? So that's why that little analogy doesn't really work. But so I took him to task on it. I was like, yeah, whatever you say. LOL. I was like, people who actually take academic philosophy don't say codswallop like that. And so he tried to fire back. Oh well, people who the people who do academic science do. I was like, well, and this is before I knew he was a scientist. I was like, well, frankly, you're neither, sir. But continue on. Hashtag Dunning-Kruger effect. So he wanted to, wanted to give me his bona fides. He's like, well, I think me being an associate clinical lecturer at a major university proves you wrong. The quote I posted has been around since the 19th century and is well known by most scientific academics. You might want to Google it. So, okay. So what? An appeal to traditional wisdom doesn't make a claim better. It doesn't. There's no veracity in appealing to traditional wisdom because traditional wisdom, like any other claim, can just be true or false. I went over that, and for any Proposition P video, if you guys want to check that out, I'll link it. um, so I was like, well, sure, my error. In any case, most Nobel laureate physicists have had a high esteem of philosophy. Science popularizers who don't do research, not so much. And being an expert in any field doesn't make you exempt from the Dunning-Kruger effect, but I'm sure cliched assertions are necessarily true, salva veritate, which is a fancy Latin word for saying truth preserving. So, saying if you substitute one statement for another, it still preserves the truth value of that statement. So basically I'm being sarcastic. Okay. Um, and so he only thing he could really say is, oh, now there's a thought terminating cliche. So that's why philosophy makes you better at thinking on your feet. And again, scientists do philosophy. What's dangerous is the case when scientists don't realize they're still doing philosophy. They're just doing philosophy that's already been well tested. Okay? So just wanted to go over that because I thought it was pretty funny. A lot of scientists are dismissive of philosophy, and Neil deGrasse Tyson has been so as well. But again, he's dismissive of philosophy, particularly philosophy of science, as is Bill Nye and Lawrence Krauss. But their colleagues who are also CSI fellows, Committee of Skeptical Inquiry fellows, are fellow philosophers who are pretty well known in their fields. People like Daniel Dennett, who you may have heard of, or maybe not. You may have heard of him because he was one of the four horsemen of the of New Atheism, like that was popular, like 12 years ago. Like Richard Dawkins, and all those other guys. But he's a big guy in philosophy, or at least he was. A lot of academic philosophers think he's kind of lost his touch because he doesn't do strictly philosophy anymore. Dennett thinks is a strength. The other philosophers think is a weakness. So I don't know where you draw that line. Then there's another guy. I'm gonna butcher his name, so apologies in advance. But Massimo Peglucci. I'm probably saying his name wrong. He's Italian. He's a eminent philosophy professor. And again, they both took Neil deGrasse Tyson and Lawrence Krauss and Bill Nye to task for denigrating philosophy. Especially when they're actively doing philosophy, they just don't realize that they're making philosophical assumptions in the science that they do. But enough of that. I just wanted to talk on some geeky stuff. I'll leave a link about Bill Nye and him being taken to task by one of his CSI fellows as well. Okay, guys. But again, I'm just a contrarian.